G'day wherever you may be around the world, and thank you for your company on truth2u.org. That's truth number 2, letter U.org. Joining me this hour is one of the world's foremost authorities on missionaries, cults, and the Jewish community. He is Director of Education and Counseling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca, jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Great to be here, Jono.
Wonderful to have you back on the program, my friend. Now, listen, what we were talking about last week, and we were talking about the rules of play for what we were going to do. We were wanting to investigate the supposed 365 prophecies of Jesus in the Tanakh.
Brought to you by God.
There it is, 365, one for every single day of the year, although there are many different lists, and some of them vary from 300 up to 600, as you were saying. So I want to tell you a story and see what you think. You ready?
Shoot.
All right. Facebook. Don't we love Facebook? Boy, Facebook has all these little, secret compartments in Facebook, and one of them is in the, you've got your messages. You can click on messages there on the left-hand side. It takes you to your inbox. And it says to you up in the left-hand side in the inbox how many messages that you have. And then it has next to that, other. Have you ever noticed that?
I never noticed that.
So many people don't know there is this other section. What do you mean other? Have I got messages or not? These are my inbox and it's got messages and then other. What is other? So I thought, I better click on other and see. And there's all these other messages that I hadn't got. Why? I don't understand. Why are they? Now, the reason why I think they're in the other section is because perhaps they're not friends, they're not registered as friends on Facebook, and therefore they get put into the other category. Okay, so I have a look at that, and I've got a message there. There's a few messages, and one of them is from an individual, and I'm going to read it to you. Ready for this?
Sure, go ahead. I'm curious.
Blessings, Jono, it begins. I thought this might interest you. And so I thought, okay, things that might interest me. I'm interested already. It goes on to say, I just heard about this first time ever free. I love free things. Michael, do you like free things? This is free. Okay. The first time ever free Messianic prophecy Bible. And I thought, this is great because we're doing Messianic prophecies at the moment, you and I. This would be gold and it's free. And then this person says, I heard about this first time ever free Messianic prophecy Bible that is going to explain the Messianic prophecies right in the text of the Bible. Wow. It goes on to say the Bible will be in many different versions and languages. This Bible will really help us to grow in our Christian/Messianic faith, understand the Jewish roots of our faith, and learn about Messianic prophecies. It is free. It's a free offer. This person says that I have accepted, and I think you should too. The Messianic Prophecy Bible Project will be distributing these Bibles to Jewish people around the world who do not believe in Yeshua. Just click on this link. So I thought, well, this is great. It's free. I mean, why not? So
can't beat free.
I clicked on the link anyway. And first I went and checked out this person who sent it to me. We're not friends on Facebook, but I went to their Facebook page. Lo and behold, they work for the company. I thought, hang on a minute. They said to me, I just heard about this free Bible. I took up the offer and I think you should too. I go to their page and they work for it. Of course they heard about it. Anyway.
I guess it's called promotion.
It's exactly what it's called. It's called promotion. Anyway, I clicked on the link. I went to the Messianic Prophecy Bible Project. I clicked on About, and guess what I saw?
Oh, I think you saw my face.
There's a picture of you! How about that? There's a picture of you there. And I thought, this is too good to be true. Now, this is what it says. Why the need for this Bible? At present, it goes on to say, there is no Bible that can be used in evangelistic outreach to unsaved Jewish people that exposes the truth of the Messianic prophecies in such a way that Jewish people understand and relate to. Searching for the promised Messiah in the current Bible can be confusing for a Jewish person due to unfamiliar Christian terminology and the lack of explanation of the Messianic prophecies. When a Jewish person goes to a family member or their rabbi for answers about the Messianic prophecies, they are told how Yeshua is not the promised Messiah, and so they give up their search. Add to this confusion the fact that for over 15 years, anti-missionary organizations such as Aish HaTorah and Jews for Judaism they've been systematically attempting to discredit Messianic prophecies and Jewish faith in Yeshua. They publish anti-missionary material with such inflammatory headlines as dealing with missionary tactics. Jesus was not our Passover lamb, the missionary menace, the real Messiah, the battle for the Jewish soul, and why Jews can't be for Jesus. It is clear that an accurately researched Messianic prophecy Bible is needed to reach unsaved Jewish people. Now, it says here, it's got some samples of this hideous anti-Messianic literature, and it refers to people who distribute such, and I was surprised at this, it refers to people who distribute such as the enemies of our faith. I thought, wow, the enemies of, and you must be enemy number one because there's a photo of you. Now, a couple of things about this photo. It says, click on this to read. First of all, your beard was bigger then. What happened?
Well, it's summertime now, and I just got my hair cut today, and I had the barber chop it off. So this picture was obviously taken in winter. There's a pretty healthy beard going on there on Michael Skobac, but I clicked on this link to have a look at what it says, and of course it's entitled Operation Let My People Know. It says Jews across the nation can receive vital counter-missionary information for free. Jews for Judaism, the world's leading counter-missionary organization, is launching a powerful new campaign called Let My People Know. This campaign, the first of its kind in the world, is geared to make Jews missionary smart by giving them free of charge vital materials and information that they can use to prepare them for any encounter with any of the over 900 missionary groups that are targeting Jews today. And in your hand, there's a picture of you and you're holding some sort of prehistoric device. What's that? Cassette tape, probably.
It's a cassette tape! But now these things are still, now tell me, technology is advanced and we've got, what do we have, MP3s now? We can download them off the website. What's going on?
The cloud. It's in the cloud.
It's in the cloud! All right, so Jews for Judaism, they're up there with technology. They've got it under control. You can go to the website and you can find these things. Now, look, I continued on. Now, before I do continue on, they refer to you and people like your fine self as enemies of our faith, and they refer to you as anti-missionaries. I go to this newsletter of yours, and it refers to counter-missionaries. Before we continue, do you want to just tell us the difference between the two?
Well, I think that it's a matter of semantics. I'm just personally turned off by the term anti-missionary. I'm not really anti anyone or anything. I actually see myself as a missionary, if you want to put in those terms. But I think it has a different kind of edge to it. Anti just sounds negative. It sounds hostile. And,
Well, would you agree that any missionary of any faith have the rights to missionize, have the right to evangelize, they have the right to tell other people about the faith that they so sincerely believe in? Is that
sure?
Fair?
I mean, one of the things that, many missionaries can thank me for is I often have to defend them because, so many people, unfortunately, in the Jewish community are so scandalized by what these groups are doing, that they would like to, if they could, just close them up, shut them down, and force them to stop doing what they're doing. And I always have to explain, thank God, we're living in a free country and people have a right to practice their religion. And, they assume that our organization is there to stop people from evangelizing. And nothing could be further from the truth. We don't engage in those kind of activities. And I think that the term anti-missionary, has that kind of ring to it that, is somehow dedicated to stopping people from doing what they're doing. And that's really totally not true. So I think that, if the word anti-missionary carries that connotation, that our work is to prevent people from sharing their faith, then I think that it's a term which to me is inaccurate, and I think it's inappropriate. And that's why counter-missionary has to me, the connotation, the ring, that we are basically giving another perspective to what they're teaching, meaning that they have. I remember when I used to watch as a kid Saturday Night Live, so they had a segment called Point Counterpoint, right? So that the missionary has a point, a perspective, and so as counter missionaries, we are countering what they're doing. We're not.
And so what you're doing is you're just saying we would like the opportunity to exercise the same right that they are exercising.
Yes, and I think that our work is really borne out by a tremendous amount of experience. And the one thing, I've been now involved in this since really 1973. When I first got involved with this kind of work, but really full-time since 1983. So we're talking about, a long time and a lot of experience, and it's been corroborated by my colleagues. And the one thing that we've found over the years is that, unfortunately, the many, many Jewish people who are swayed to embrace the Christian faith, they really have not made informed decisions. Meaning that, there are people who generally may have had some kind of exposure to Jewish practice. Typically, they may have gone to Hebrew school, and often their families may have had some kind of Jewish practice, like celebrating Passover or Hanukkah. But really, we're not talking about people that have had a very sophisticated and serious kind of dip in Jewish learning and Jewish education. And what happens is they, at some point in life, either as a teenager or in their 20s or 30s or 40s, have some encounter with Christians, with people in their lives. It could be a coworker, it could be a neighbor, a friend, a business associate, but it's someone that shares their faith with them as a Christian and shares the gospel. And now, for the first time, these Jewish people are exposed to what I would call the case for Christianity, the case for belief in Jesus. And it's quite sophisticated and it's compelling. And for Jewish people that have not had a real serious kind of exposure to Jewish learning and Jewish study and a Jewish perspective on the scriptures, which is invariably the case, the Christian case for Jesus can be a serious one and a compelling one. And what happens with those Jews who ultimately do end up converting to Christianity, embracing Jesus as their Savior, our experience has been, my personal experience has been, that they really are impressed with the Christians they meet, and they're impressed with the testimonies they hear, and they're impressed with the fervor of Christian worship, and they're impressed with all of the biblical quote-unquote proofs that point to Jesus allegedly, and all of the miracles that they read about, and all of the miracles that they experience in church, etc. And they say, listen, I can't resist. And our challenge is that, it's true that you've heard the case for Jesus, but, for the last 2,000 years, Jewish people preferred death to conversion. And, wouldn't it be appropriate, before you make that very, very serious decision, before you take that step, which is, from a Jewish point of view, a very, very profound mistake, in the same way that Christianity insists that people who don't believe in Jesus will essentially burn in hell forever. Judaism takes a very similar perspective to people who worship Jesus as God. That in the Bible, the one thing God says that he abhors and despises is idolatry. And idolatry is basically defined as the worship of anything or anyone as God that is not God. Now, obviously, Christians believe Jesus is God, but again, that may not be the case. And Judaism doesn't believe that Jesus created the world and is God, and therefore to put your faith in him and to worship him would be idolatry. So the point here is not to therefore insist that Judaism is right, but it's just for people to understand this is a very weighty decision. Meaning that it seems to me, that, at least, that in life, when we're going to make a decision where the consequences are potentially very, very serious, then it makes sense in those situations to be very, very careful and to look both ways before you cross the street.
That's an excellent way to put it. To look both ways before you cross the street. What an excellent way to put it. So we're going to go back to the original list. We'll kick off from Genesis. Now, in this case, we're going to try and get through 1 to 14 in the chronological order that they appear. And it begins in Genesis chapter 3, right?
That's where most of these lists begin. I think that if they had some more imagination, they could have started in Genesis chapter 1. I mean, when you go through this list and you see the nature of the connections that are made between the text in Genesis and Jesus, I mean, you realize that with any kind of imagination, you could probably come up with a list of 3,000 or 4,000 easily just in the book of Genesis. That's how flexible the criteria are here.
Well, that's a good point. The flexibility of criteria, and this is what people are going to see. And there's, I mean, the first two, in fact, are found in Genesis 3:15. The first one is that the Messiah. Now, bear in mind, just a reminder to the listeners, these are quote unquote messianic prophecies, and Genesis 3:15 says that the Messiah will be of the seed of a woman, and that appears in Genesis 3:15. Does this apply to the Messiah? And it's got in brackets here the virgin birth. Is this what we have in Genesis 3:15?
That's the assertion that's being made. I mean, it's important to remember that the passage here in Genesis chapter 3, it doesn't mention the Messiah. The assertion here is that this is a foreshadowing of this very, very important doctrine in Christianity, which appears in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, which is the idea that Jesus was born to a virgin and had to have been born to a virgin. I mean, I think that many people...
We're talking about Isaiah chapter 7, right? I mean,
yes.
How do we apply this to Genesis chapter 3? Let me just read it for the listeners. I'll start from 14 to be fair, because we've got to give some context. This is God talking to the serpent, and he says, "Because you have done this, you are accursed more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." By the way, I have seed, capital S, her seed, capital S, in the New King James Study Bible. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Where do we get the virgin birth and something about the Messiah here in this verse? It's just very bizarre.
Well, so the virgin birth really comes from the reference to her seed. I mean, that the passage here speaks about the descendants of Eve as her seed.
Because of course women have eggs, they don't have seed, right?
Right. I mean, usually the assumption here is that it's the male that has the seed.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it speaks in this verse about the seed of the woman, it's implying that there's no man here. I mean, that it's an unusual birth in that normally
okay.
a child would be referred to the seed of the male, but there's no male that's mentioned here, and so it has this seemingly unusual.
But if we follow that logic, then aren't we talking about a hermaphrodite or something? I mean, it doesn't talk about God's seed impregnating a woman. It talks about the woman's seed. That makes no sense in as far as the Christian interpretation of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, right?
Well, we'll have to really dig our teeth into Isaiah chapter 7. But you're quite right, meaning that here, if we just stick to the text in this chapter of Genesis, it does refer to the seed of the woman. And if the argument is that there's only the woman here and there's no male, so how do we know that it was God that impregnates her? That's not in the text.
It's not in the text.
Right. That would be an assumption that's being made. And you're right. You could argue that she was somehow one of these creatures that is able to get pregnant all by herself. Maybe she, I don't know, had both male and female capabilities.
These are the kind of ridiculous things that we have to speculate just to, perhaps make this work in as far as what Christian interpretation would have us believe.
Well, the Christian assumption here is really based upon quite a few suppositions. The most serious supposition is that the reference in this verse to the seed of a woman, to Eve's seed, is unusual, meaning that they seem to be all agitated by the fact that it refers to the seed of a woman. But the truth is that it's not unusual in the Bible. The Bible has a number of references to a woman's descendants, a woman's offspring as her seed. Meaning that, it's funny that in English we have these different words. We have the words children, offspring, seed. And so if the Bible had, was written in English and the Bible said, the offspring of the woman, it wouldn't be so peculiar, or the children of the woman. The fact that it uses seed of the woman, the word in Hebrew is zera, which is also the word used for sperm. So it seems unusual that, what do you mean the seed of a woman? We often associate seed with man. But the problem is that you have a number of places, in Genesis actually, which refers to a woman's offspring or progeny as her seed. For example, in Genesis 16:10, God promises Hagar, who was given to Abraham by Sarah as a co-wife. So God promises to Hagar that he will greatly increase her seed.
And what I've got, did you say verse 10?
I believe it's Genesis 16, verse 10. Yes.
So I've got here, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly so that they shall not be counted for multitude.
And now, so there, the word descendants in Hebrew would be seed.
There you go. All right. Well, okay. Why not be consistent then and say, I will multiply your seed exceedingly?
Well, because
we can't have that.
Well, I think that no one's going to argue that Jesus was a descendant of Hagar. I think that Christians would be very happy if there was a promise here to, let's say, Sarah, and then they would be able to see ultimately some promise to Sarah as having a descendant who would be the Savior. But here it's a promise to Hagar. And I don't think anyone's going to suggest that Jesus has any kind of connection.
No, that's fair enough. We can't have the Messiah coming from Hagar. We can't do that.
That wouldn't be proper.
That doesn't work. We can't do that. All right. So
but
there's
the Bible does speak about her offspring as her seed. And also in Genesis 24, verse 60, it speaks to Rebekah that her offspring will inherit the gate of their enemies. We see in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 13, it refers to the priest's daughter. Her offspring is referred to as seed. And in Numbers 5:28, the Sota, the woman who was suspected of adultery and had to drink this concoction in the temple, so it says in Numbers 5 that if she's innocent, she will bear children. And there again, the word for her children is her seed. And 1 Samuel chapter 1, Hannah, when she asks for a child for herself, she's asking for Zerah as well. So you have in the Bible many references to a woman's offspring as her seed. So there's no reason to get bent out of shape when we read Genesis 3:15, and it speaks about the seed of a woman. It's just simply a way of speaking about Eve's descendants.
The offspring.
Yeah, and the important thing to remember is that it's not referring to one particular descendant, a seed. I mean, it's interesting that Paul, in the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 16, makes this mistake, that he finds a passage in Genesis about Abraham's seed, and Paul says, quite erroneously, he said, you see, it doesn't say seeds in the plural, it says to his seed,
singular.
And that must be, Paul says, one particular descendant, and he says that must be obviously Jesus. And the fallacy here is that seed in the Bible is referring to descendants, offspring, all of the offspring, and the Bible never speaks about seeds in the plural. The word is always in the singular. It never distinguishes in the Hebrew between seed and seeds. Yeah. So this passage in Genesis 3 is simply speaking about the descendants, all of the offspring that would come out of this woman, all of her descendants.
Perfect sense, but that's not the only one, as I said in Genesis 3:15. There's also It says here, a Messianic prophecy, he will bruise Satan's head. And that comes out of 3:15 where it says, God says to the serpent, not Satan, but says to the serpent, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Now, we've got snakes here. Boy, do we have snakes. Brown snakes, one of the most poisonous snakes in the world. And if ever I get an opportunity to bruise one of their heads, I mean, I'd like to take them off if possible.
We don't see too many here in Toronto.
No, I bet you don't. But I don't remember that verse. I mean, I don't remember the verse that says, maybe after the temptation of Jesus, when Jesus says to Satan, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And then he thus did deliver a roundhouse kick to the head. And Satan did flee, yea, verily. Yeah, that verse isn't there. I tell you what, though, if it was, that'd be great. But it's not there. There's nothing like that. I don't remember Jesus bruising Satan's head. Can you help me?
Well, it's interesting because, there are many Christian commentaries to the Bible which don't really take this as a prophecy about, the Messiah somehow in the future disposing of Satan and destroying Satan. There are many Christian commentaries that take this passage in Genesis in a very straightforward way, that it's speaking about, in the simplest sense, in the most straightforward sense, the incredible animosity that would always exist between human beings and snakes. And it says that snakes will strike human beings at their heel, because snakes, we're told just in the few verses previous to this, that the snake would be cursed, that it'll have to crawl on the ground. So as an animal that crawls on the ground, it will be able to strike not at our neck, it won't be able to strike in the upper part of our body, it's going to have to strike us, try to bite us in our heel.
At the heel. And by the way, this is why here on the farm, in spring and summer, we always tell our kids, if you go out into the paddock, you put on your boots, because our boots come up over our ankles, and we know that they're going to be protected. Otherwise, you just can't guarantee. You can't go out there in your flip-flops. It's way too dangerous. I mean, a brown snake will kill you in a matter of minutes. And there is that relationship, and boy, do we know about it.
Right, and those boots will end up, as this verse says, crushing the head of the snake. When the snake wants to get us, the snake will strike at our heel. And when we want to strike the snake, we're not going to step on his tail. We're going to crush its head.
That's right.
That's really what the verse is ultimately saying. It's basically speaking about this enmity between the descendants of Eve, which is all of humanity, all humankind. It's interesting, by the way, that this fear of snakes and sort of revulsion of snakes is a universal phenomenon. No matter where you go in the world over the past, thousands of years, this passage has been true. We have this relationship with snakes, which is not a friendly one. And what's interesting is that Christians insist that it's not really only talking about the snake in the garden, that it's somehow referring to this
the devil,
Satan, this spiritual being, which is their right to do, meaning that it's certainly, there's no crime in claiming that a passage in the Bible symbolizes or somehow has some connection to something else. But it's not in the text, meaning that it's a supposition that's made. And once you get into the realm of supposition or of interpretation, it loses the power of proof, meaning that we have to remember that this list of 365 proofs is presented as evidence, as proof. And once your evidence is not really based upon what the text actually says, but it's based upon a supposition in terms of what we think the verse might be symbolizing or referring to, then you get into very, very muddy water. I always teach my classes that once a text can mean anything, it means nothing. Meaning that once you're allowed to say, well, I think that it represents this, or I think it represents that, then you're not really in the realm of proving anything anymore. You're
speculating.
You're speculating, and you can only prove something when you're basing yourself upon what the text actually says. When it comes to this supposition that's made that it's really, some reference to, the Messiah, which is not mentioned in the passage at all. But it's an interpretation, it's a speculation. The Messiah who will bruise Satan's head. Again, it's based upon the assumption that it's referring to only one of Eve's descendants, meaning that we saw the passage is speaking about all of her descendants. There's no reason to assume that it's speaking about one person who will smash the snake, or even here the Satan. But the important thing to recall is that, the list that we have here in front of us takes us to Hebrews 2:14 as the fulfillment of this passage. Now, it says in Hebrews 2:14 that through the death of Jesus, basically, he would render powerless him who had the power over death, and that is the devil. That meaning that through the death of Jesus was supposedly able to destroy the power of the devil. And that's the claim here, that Jesus came to destroy.
That's the connection as some sort of fulfillment to this part of Genesis 3. But there's no roundhouse kick to the head. Where's the bruise? I want the bruise to Satan's head. Well, we have no specific verse.
What you don't see is that Satan has been destroyed. Meaning that, it's interesting that 1 John 3:8 says that he who practices sin is of the devil. Meaning that we know that even the Christian Bible says that Christians, people that believe in Jesus, still sin. And yet it says here that if you sin, you're of the devil. And it's clear then that Jesus did not destroy the power of the devil if people still sin. Even among followers of Jesus in the Christian Bible, in 1 Thessalonians 2:18, Paul says he wanted to come to see the Thessalonians, but he wasn't able to because he was hindered by the devil. He was hindered by Satan. So we see that through the death of Jesus, Satan's power was not destroyed. There's no indication. As a matter of fact, in Romans 16:20, Paul writes that Satan will soon be crushed. But obviously it hadn't happened yet when he was writing the book of Romans.
That's a good point.
So there's no fulfillment, meaning that this is one of these passages in Genesis 3 which is really not about the Messiah when we read Genesis. And even if it were about the Messiah, there's no proof that it's talking about Jesus. Right? It could be, if you want to insist that it is speaking about someone who will crush the power of Satan, there's no proof that it's talking about Jesus because Jesus clearly hasn't done that. So it's still a prophecy which, even though Christians insist that Jesus fulfilled it, it's not really so obvious that Genesis 3 is speaking about the Messiah, and it's very clear that it has not been fulfilled by Jesus.
Fair enough. And I mean, we could get into a long conversation about the nature of Satan, but we don't have time for that.
Right. We got to rock and roll.
We got to rock and roll. Number 3 is Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. I'm going to start from 23, if that's all right. This is what it says in our list of 365 Messianic prophecies. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. What a coincidence! 365 years. And there must be something in that. Surely we can make... No, we better not. And verse 24. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now, this apparently, Michael, is the bodily ascension of the Messiah to heaven, illustrated in this passage. What do you make of it?
You don't sound convinced.
Well, come on! It's meant to be. It's a messianic prophecy fulfilled. Because, in, what is it, Mark chapter 6, verse 19, Jesus is sucked up to heaven. He ascends. And this is the prototype of that is Enoch. At least that's what this verse, what this list is claiming.
Well, it's interesting because the passage here is certainly not a prophecy. It's not a prediction. It's a narrative that's telling us what happened to Hanoch, or Enoch in English. And it's interesting because all it says in the Hebrew is that God had taken him, that he walked with God, but he was no more because God had taken him. Now, it's not really clear what that means, that God had taken him. It could certainly mean that he died. And that's how Rashi understands the passage.
No, what do you mean? It's the Wizard of Oz. What, are you going to take that away from me? It's the Wizard of Oz. He was sucked up into heaven.
Well, I guess you could suggest that's what happened to him. When it says that that God had taken him, it's interesting because, we say in English, I took his life.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily here mean that God took him bodily up to heaven. I think it's a possible way of reading it. It certainly doesn't exclude that possibility. But the phrase itself is pretty ambiguous. What does it mean that God took him? He was no more. That's what it says here, that he was no more. He was basically finished.
And this is actually, when you think about it, this is a phrase that we use today. It's not unusual to hear someone say, God took so-and-so to mean that their life has ended.
Yeah,
They passed away, God took them. You hear that today.
I think that, the phrase itself is not clear. And it's certainly not predicting anything in the future. It's just saying what happened to Enoch. It's not a prophecy here. It's a narrative about what happened to this particular person, and there's nothing in the passage which connects this to the Messiah. Now, we know that in the Bible there are bodily ascensions to heaven. It happened to Elijah in the second book of Kings. Elijah the prophet is basically taken right up to heaven without dying. But, even if we wanted to say, for example, if reading Genesis 5, that this mysterious verse, which speaks about God taking Enoch, has some kind of a connection to a person in the future who would be taken up to heaven, it's not clear in this passage that it's talking about it would happen to the Messiah. And even if it was, there's no proof that Jesus did this, meaning that we don't have any reason to assume that Jesus was taken alive up to heaven. That's a belief and an assertion that Christians make. But we have to remember that the claim here is that if we read the Hebrew Scriptures with an open mind and an open heart, we will see clearly that it points to Jesus, that we have overwhelming evidence. We have 365 pieces of evidence that point clearly and directly and unambiguously to Jesus. Well, this and most of these passages only work if you only begin the entire investigation with the assumptions that Christianity makes about Jesus. Meaning, if you assume that he was the Messiah and God took him up to heaven bodily, then if this passage in Genesis 5 is a prophecy about the Messiah who would be taken up to heaven, then it would be talking about Jesus. But we have a half a dozen assumptions there that are not.
We do.
Really...
We have even the description in the list that we're looking at says that it's an illustration. How can a messianic prophecy be an illustration? It's just not. It's just so nebulous, isn't it?
Yeah, this is what we referred to last week as a type or a shadow. That this is a belief that Christians have. Their belief that Jesus was brought to heaven, and they see this as a foreshadowing of that. But again, it's not really working in the way they would like it to work, meaning that they would like us to think that here is another piece of evidence that basically seals the deal and makes it clear that Jesus was the Messiah. And again, we just have to look at this passage and see it's not a prophecy, it's a narrative, it's not talking about the Messiah. And all it is that if you make all the assumptions that Christians want to make about it, meaning that if we assume it is speaking about someone that's taken up to heaven bodily, then all you could say is that it somehow corresponds with what Christians believe about Jesus. But it only works retroactively, meaning it's basically circular reasoning or working backward. It doesn't go from Genesis to Jesus. That's what I want to really emphasize. You can certainly go from Jesus back to Genesis, meaning once you have your beliefs about Jesus cemented, you can then go back to Genesis and say, oh, you see, Genesis seems to be alluding to, symbolizing, it's a foreshadowing of what we already believe. But what can't happen, what doesn't work, is to say that by reading Genesis, you're going to arrive at Jesus being the Messiah. That doesn't work because Genesis is, again, not a prophecy, and it's not about the Messiah, and again, it's not clearly speaking about someone who's translated up to heaven alive. So, it only works retroactively, sort of through circular reasoning, if you already believe in Jesus, and it only works in that sense if you have to make quite a few assumptions about what the text really means.
There it is. Number 4, Genesis. Now, this one has really got me. I don't know what to make of this at all. Genesis chapter 9, verse 26 and 27. Now, the notes on this list say the God of Shem will be the son of Shem. But this is what the verse says. It says, and he said, blessed be the Lord, may God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. I don't understand. It says in the notes here of this list, the God of Shem will be the son of Shem. Where do they? I don't understand.
Yeah, this is basically what you would simply call, in simple English, a mistake. that right. There's no way of getting from the text in Genesis to what they're claiming it means. There's no way of even misreading this verse to have it say that God will be the son of Shem. So this is just a blunder. And all that the passage really is saying is that God will essentially dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, Shem, we know, is going to be the son of Noah. That's going to be the forerunner of Abraham. Abraham descends from Shem. And the idea is that God will ultimately dwell in the tabernacle and later in the temple. Those are called the dwelling places of God. And ultimately in the final temple that will be rebuilt, as we read in the book of Ezekiel. So all this is really saying is that God, the Creator, will dwell in the tents. And the tent, the tabernacle is almost referred to as a tent.
Yes.
So that's all the verse is saying, and there's just nothing here that.
Absolutely nothing. That's what I thought it was saying. It makes perfect sense when you read it in its context. But the assertion that they're making is very difficult and problematic. We're not doing too well so far for the first two. I'm not convinced. Are you convinced?
I'm not going to be going to church this Sunday yet.
All right, not yet. Well, we better move to 5 and see if that'll do it. Here's a familiar verse, and one that is very timely, I think, with everything going on in Israel at the moment. Genesis 12, verse 3, it says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
It's a beautiful passage.
It's a beautiful, it really is. According to this list, 365 Messianic prophecies, according to this list, as Abraham's seed will bless all nations. What's it getting at there?
They say that sometimes when you read the Bible in translation, it's like kissing your mother through a veil. You lose so much when you're reading the Bible in English, and there's something in the Hebrew here that is just very, very significant. It speaks about blessing and cursing, and the Bible speaks about God who will bless those who bless the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham. And there the word is the same word. It's the root baruch, beis resh chaf. So there you have basically a parallelism, that those who bless you, I will bless. But when it comes to the word for cursing, the Bible uses two different words in the Hebrew. Now, it doesn't come through in English because it just says, those who curse you, I will curse. But in the Hebrew, it says those that curse you, mekalelcha, because that word can mean a curse, a klala, but it doesn't use the same Hebrew word for I will curse. It changes and says I will curse is aor. And that is another word in Hebrew that can mean to curse, but another way of translating it is that I will show the light. Meaning that what the verse is, not clearly saying, but it's a beautiful rendering of the verse is, those that bless you I will bless, but those that curse you I will show the light. Meaning that ultimately the enemies of the Jewish people will one day come to see the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the passage here is, again, not about one particular descendant of Abraham. It's speaking when it says the seed of Abraham, right? It refers to all of the descendants of Abraham. And all the verse is really saying is that the entire world will be blessed through the nation that Abraham will be the progenitor of.
Right.
And we see this in countless passages in the Bible. The last chapters of Isaiah, chapter 60 in Isaiah, which speaks about the nations of the world coming to the light of the Jewish people, and the prophet Zechariah, who says that one day, 10 people from every nation of the world will grab hold of the clothing of a Jew and say, "We want to come follow you. We've heard God is with you." So the Bible speaks about these people who God calls his witnesses, and who were to be a Mamleches Kohanim, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and a light to the nations. So the Bible says that that's our task, and that one day the world will come to our light. And so that's essentially what this verse is saying, that the descendants of Abraham will be ultimately a blessing to all the nations of the world. Now, even if you want to say, by the way, that it is referring to one descendant of Abraham, which is incorrect grammatically, but even if you were to read it that way, how do we know that it's referring to Jesus? Maybe it's another descendant of Abraham, like Moses or David. So again, it's based upon here, the Christian reading is based upon a misreading of the Hebrew to say it's talking about one descendant of Abraham, because it misreads the word seed. And even if they insist on that mistranslation, it doesn't have to refer to the person they think it's referring to. We could certainly say that Moses was a great blessing to the world, and David was certainly a great blessing to the world.
Amen. And so it's, again, as with the first example in 3:15, it's a little bit of trickery with the word seed, and the next one is no exception. It falls into the same category. Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, and it says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said to your..." Now I've got in my New King James Study Bible, I've got "to your descendants I will give this land," and there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him.
Now what's interesting, by the way, is that all it's really saying here is that there's a promise that the land of Israel will be given to Abraham's children. So there's nothing here about the Messiah coming one day, nothing here about a particular descendant of Abraham. This is simply a passage which is saying the promise made to Abraham's seed is that they would inherit the land of Israel. I don't know how we get from that to the gospel, but there you have it.
But they think there's a connection. Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. Now I've got... Good heavens, apparently there's 3 messianic prophecies fulfilled in this one verse alone. This, of course, is Melchizedek. This is verse 18. It says, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine." Oh, this is of course, this is the precursor to, this is the prophecy of that he was having communion. Don't you see? This is the Eucharist.
Why did
Melchizedek.
I see that? I don't know. I have these scales over my eyes.
You have a veil over your face. This is the problem, you see. You need me to tell you. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth," and so on and so forth. Now, in this one verse of 18, it says that a priest after Melchizedek. This verse doesn't say anything about a priest after Melchizedek. This is an assertion made in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20. It talks about the next one, number 8, a king also. I don't know what it's alluding to there. And number 9 of the Messianic prophecies list, the Last Supper foreshadowed. See? The Eucharist. It's communion.
Well, this is a great example of what we'd call double billing or triple billing. I mean that here you have one verse which is really counted as 3 different prophecies from this list of 365. It reminds me when I was a kid, most people probably when we were kids, and you had to come up with your first resume for your first job, you probably didn't have that many things that you did, before your first job, and you had to really stretch things to squeeze out as many possible jobs that you could. So, it's sort of strange that they're taking this one passage in Genesis 14:18 and claiming that it has 3 messianic prophecies here. The name of Melchizedek, in Hebrew, so it says here that it foreshadows a king of peace and righteousness. Obviously, they're asserting that Jesus was a king of peace and righteousness. So Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and he was called in this passage Melech Shalem. Now, it seems to be talking about a place called Shalem, or in English Salem, but it can be related to the word shalom, peace. So here you have in this verse alluding to the idea that this person, Melchizedek, somehow is connected to both peace and righteousness. But again, we have here a narrative. There's no prophecy here. It's not predicting anything. It's just a story we're reading. It mentions this character named Melchizedek. And the fact that he brought out bread and wine, it's a food that's served at about 50 or 60% of the meals eaten by most people in the world. So it's very difficult to say that somehow this passage is referring to the Last Supper that Jesus ate. It's interesting also, by the way, that according to the Synoptic Gospels, the Last Supper would have been a Passover Seder, in which case they wouldn't have had bread. They would have been eating matzah.
That's a very good point. There you go, that's right.
But again, when you read this passage, Genesis, just for in its own context, it's not talking about a Passover Seder. It's not talking about any kind of a special meal that's going to be eaten by the Messiah. The passage really has nothing to do with the Messiah at all. It's just something that is read into it by Christians that are trying to find allusions to their beliefs in the Bible. And again, I just want to repeat that. It's very important. There's a difference between getting from our text to a belief in Jesus, which really is quite impossible. And that's not what's happening. The Christian already begins with their belief in Jesus, and that his Last Supper had matzah and wine, and that they find this as somehow foreshadowing that which they already believe. But it's important to emphasize that finding passages in the Bible that have some kind of an allusion or a veiled allusion or hidden allusion to things you already believe is a far cry from being able to prove those beliefs from these passages. So again, there's been no one, and this is another technique that I would recommend. It's obvious why Christians might be able to read their beliefs back into this passage, but the critical test would be, would anyone reading this passage way before Christianity make the interpretations that Christians make? And you could apply that same criteria to virtually all of the texts we'll be reading. Meaning that we can understand why Christians get excited about these texts because they have some kind of a resonance with what they already believe. But the question to ask is, would anyone reading these texts before Christianity have this kind of interpretation? Meaning anyone reading Genesis 14:18, let's say in the times of Jeremiah the prophet, would they read Genesis 14:18 and said, oh, look at this. This is a very, very critical piece of the puzzle to help us identify who the Messiah is going to be, because it's telling us that the last meal the Messiah is going to eat is going to be a meal that has bread and wine. Now, even if that is what the passage means, it certainly wouldn't prove anything about Jesus, because half the free world eats food with meals with bread and wine. Right.
There it is. Now, the next one's, again, a little bit of trickery with the word seed. This is Genesis 17:19. It refers to the seed of Isaac. Same rule applies as we discussed before?
Yeah, and the other problem is that it's not only referring to all the descendants of Isaac, but what is it saying here about the descendants of Isaac? It's only telling us here that God is making a special covenant, an eternal covenant, with the descendants of Isaac. There's nothing here about the Messiah, nothing here about Jesus, nothing here about the gospel. It's simply a passage which is telling us that God is making a special covenant, a promise to the descendants of Isaac, to the Jewish people, and you can't really get more out of this passage. So it's really hard to see why it makes it onto this list, because there's no indication here that this passage has anything to do with the coming of the Messiah, or anything to do with the life of Jesus.
That's bizarre, isn't it? So it says, then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. What has this got to do with Jesus? Utterly bizarre.
Well, I mean, the one thing I could say is that as a member of the Jewish people, Jesus would be included in God's covenant. He is also part of the covenant.
You can say that, of course.
But it would apply to all Jewish people equally, and Jesus would not be special in that regard.
Again, with the word seed, Genesis, this is number 11, Genesis 21, verse 12, it says, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Now, interestingly, I mentioned in Genesis, in the New King James Study Bible, seed was capitalized in 3:15. Here it's not capitalized, so the New King James doesn't seem to think that this has any significance, but this list of 365 Messianic prophecies thinks that this is significant, and indeed they have applied a capital on Genesis 21, verse 12.
Yeah, I mean, this passage is, again, very clear in terms of what it really is speaking about. It's saying to Abraham that even though he's going to have children through Hagar, that his family line, his ultimate family, will be considered only the descendants that he has through Sarah and Isaac, meaning that it's really, the context here is quite clear, that it's really focusing on, who are Abraham's ultimate descendants going to be, meaning that when we speak about the family of Abraham, it's true that Ishmael is a descendant of Abraham, but in terms of the people, the special people that Abraham will be fathering, it is going through the line of Isaac, we're told here. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the coming of the Messiah, nothing to do with Jesus. It's just speaking about, in this passage, which line of Abraham's family will be the chosen line. So again, we have here basically a verse that has absolutely nothing to do with the Christian message, and it's even hard to understand why this kind of a verse makes it onto the list.
It's because you need 365. You need one for every day of the year, and you've got to scrape the bottom of the barrel to make it work. Here we are in...
Necessity is the mother of invention.
That's exactly right. Number 12, we're flying through it. Genesis chapter 22, verse 8, it says, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. There it is. You're going to church, see? You're going to church on Sunday.
This, unfortunately, doesn't do it for me either. Again, this is a great example because, we know from the Gospel of John that Jesus is called the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. So again, once you come to Genesis with the prior belief that the Messiah is the Lamb of God, so here you have a passage in Genesis which speaks about a lamb, so obviously it must be referring to Jesus. Again, it's a perfect illustration of how the Christian approach is really one that works backwards. You go from the New Testament back to Genesis, but I would insist that it is impossible to go from Genesis to the Christian gospel, because no one reading Genesis 22 prior to Christianity would have walked away assuming that this passage contains any kind of prophecy about the Messiah, any kind of connection to the coming of the Messiah. This is part of the narrative where, Isaac is asking, look, Dad, Abraham, I see you have the knife and you have the wood, and where is the lamb? And so he's told that God is going to provide the lamb. But it's interesting, by the way, that it couldn't really be speaking about Jesus, because it's very clear from this passage that this lamb was supposed to be a burnt offering, that in verse 3, Abraham takes the wood, and it's called an olah. An olah in Hebrew is an offering that's completely consumed on the fire. And in verse 9, he arranges the wood on the altar. So when finally the lamb is provided, and the Bible says here in this chapter that Abraham offered the lamb. It was offered as a burnt offering, which obviously Jesus was never burnt. So even symbolically, this would not really associate with Jesus.
Well, now, I mean, if we have to really, really search through the Torah to find a lamb that is offered for sin that is burnt, I did this, and I mean, if we can just spend a little bit of time here, the only one that I could find was in Leviticus chapter 5. I think it's from verse 14 and on, and it says that then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord, then he shall bring to the Lord as his trespass offering a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation in shekels of silver according to the shekel of the sanctuary, as a trespass offering, and he shall make restitution for the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and shall add 1/5 to it, and give it to the priest, so the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, and it shall be forgiven him. Now, is this ram a burnt offering?
So the passage in Leviticus you're reading is not about a sin offering, which was called the chatat, but you're reading about a special offering that was called an asham, the guilt offering or the trespass offering. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because this passage here in Genesis, when Abraham brings this sacrifice, there's no indication that this lamb is being offered for sin. It's very clear when we read the Bible that offerings, sacrifices were brought for many reasons. Often they were brought just to express closeness to God, to express thanksgiving to God, to express some positive emotions. And it's interesting that when John identifies Jesus as the Paschal Lamb, it's a peculiar association to make with Jesus because the Passover lamb was not brought for the purpose of atonement for sin. It was brought as a commemoration of an event in Jewish history. So if, the Christian Bible wanted to make some analog to Jesus, the most appropriate analog would have been the Yom Kippur scapegoat, the animal that was offered that took upon itself the sins of the Jewish people.
The sins, but they can't do that because the scapegoat is led off into the wilderness.
Yes.
There's the gopher Azazel. It doesn't die. It's gone. I mean,
well, it's interesting that the Bible doesn't speak about it being killed, right? The Bible just says it's sent off into the wilderness.
Yeah. Wouldn't it have been better if John the Baptist had said, "Behold the bull of God that comes and takes away the sin"? I mean, isn't the bull the sin offering?
So the only animal on the Day of Atonement that took upon itself the sins of all the people, though, was the scapegoat.
Well, that's
the other
true.
offerings were offerings for a limited. For example, one was for the high priest and his family, and one was to atone only for the impurities that came into the temple. So the only analog that really would have been appropriate for Jesus as a sacrifice would have been the scapegoat of Yom Kippur, because that was the animal that we're told bore the sins of all the people. But that was never the analog that was offered by the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible insists that Jesus was the Paschal Lamb, which again has nothing to do with the atonement for sin.
Nothing to. Now, all that aside, it's neither here nor there, because in verse 13 of Genesis 22, this prophecy, if you like, is fulfilled. It says, Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horn. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son.
Exactly, meaning that this passage, when it says in verse 8 that God would provide the lamb, it's not alluding to some kind of a prediction that's going to happen in thousands of years. It's part of the story where a few verses later this animal is provided, as it just indicated. So again, this is a passage where it's not a prophetic prediction about the Messiah coming in the future. We understand this passage simply in its own context, that Isaac notices there's no sacrifice, there's no animal. He didn't realize he was supposed to be sacrificed. Abraham says, in complete faith, that God's going to provide the lamb, which is what happened. God did provide an alternative.
It happened. It's fulfilled.
End of story.
There it is.
And
End of story.
There's no reason to look at this story in Genesis and say, well, obviously it's a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. Obviously it's talking about Jesus. I mean, again, there's nothing here about the Messiah. And if a person was hell-bent on insisting that it's talking about the Messiah, again, there's no proof that it's speaking about Jesus. It would just be an allusion to the Messiah coming one day.
Number 13. We're almost there. Number 13 of the 365 Messianic prophecies. Genesis, we're still there in chapter 22. This is verse 18, and it says, we're doing the seed again. In your seed. Now, again, in my New King James, it's still got a lowercase s, unlike 3:15, where it decided it better put a capital S. It's got a lowercase, so it doesn't agree with this list. But it says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, again, we're reiterating Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is basically a continuation of the promise that God made to Abraham, where God said to Abraham, through your descendants, the nations will be blessed. And here, God says this to Isaac, that through Isaac's seed, the nations will be blessed. And, there's no reason to read anything more into this. As I said before, if they had any imagination, they could have found thousands of proof texts here, because
what you're saying is if it was up to you to make this list, you would have done a better job.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that if I sat down, because again, you could say, here's I'll just give you a simple example.
Sure.
Here's someone in Genesis that's walking around with a robe. Well, Jesus wore a robe, so this must be some allusion to Jesus. If you wanted to basically find every possible, and you could see in just the few that we did so far, how much latitude they took in interpreting these passages. Where someone that brings out bread and wine to serve at a meal, that somehow automatically becomes the Eucharist and the Last Supper. You could find easily many, many more things that the text in the Bible has in common with Jesus. If someone walks in the Bible, well, Jesus walked. And if someone went down to sleep, Jesus went down to sleep. Think about how many passages in Genesis speak about people's seed. So every time you have the word seed, it's very easy to get very excited and say, look, it's talking about this special person. So I think that, if we take the criteria that is used to select these kind of passages, it could easily have been expanded to several thousand. Thankfully, we're not going to go through that many.
No, we're not doing that. In fact, the last one we want to look at today, again, a little bit of trickery with the word seed, Genesis 26, and they've got verses 2 to 5, which says, then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, live in the land which I shall tell you, dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed, lowercase s, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed again. And we've already spoken about that. Boy, I tell you what, it really does mess with the word seed repeatedly in this list at the beginning.
And here, the list here makes the assertion that this is foreshadowing Isaac's seed that will be promised as the Redeemer.
That's what it says in this list.
Now, when we just read this passage in Genesis 26, it says nothing about a Redeemer. It just basically speaks about the descendants of Isaac inheriting the land of Israel, and that...
No. It's got to have. They can't just. There's got to be. I'm going to read it again. Wait. There's got to be the word redeemed. No, I mean you can't just put in a word like that. It's got to be here. Just let me look again.
Look in the fine print.
Perform the oath I don't even have any asterisks or anything with the fine print. I'll make your descendants multiply the seeds, the stars of heaven, descendants of the land. Well, it's got to be in the next verse. Hang on. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Well, there's nothing in here that says anything about a redeemer. Where do they get that?
That's a good question.
All right.
Well, we have seen already a dozen or so passages where there's the insistence that we're being told something very clearly about the coming of the Messiah, the Redeemer. And the one thing we've seen so far is that there's nothing clear at all. And I think that's, again, let me just, I guess, as we're closing up tonight, say that when we're studying the Bible, we want to see what the Bible teaches clearly and consistently. I mean, what is the Bible really teaching us? And when we read the Bible, we shouldn't be interested in trying to see how much of our preconceptions we can squeeze back into the Bible. It's not really the way the Bible should be studied. We should try and study the Bible for what it actually teaches and what it teaches clearly. And the one thing we've seen through all these passages is that not one of them is a clear reference to the coming of the Messiah. And just as a footnote to that, even if they were, none of them would be clearly pointing to Jesus exclusively, meaning that basically what all of these passages have in common is the assumption that they're talking about the Messiah and the assumption that that Messiah is Jesus. And these passages really don't point to either of these two ideas. They don't really refer to the Messiah, and they don't clearly identify Jesus. These are basically a dozen or so passages where people that have a preconceived belief, not based upon what the Bible says. That's the important part of it. They have this belief independent of what the Bible says, and then they're able to somehow very creatively and by a very loose and expansive and poetic and subjective reading of these passages find some kind of veiled allusion, hint, type, shadow, etc. to what they already believe, which is fine. Everyone has the right to do that, but I think they have to be careful before they say, well, look, we believe that the Bible clearly proves with many, many pieces of evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. I think that's where they're going to fall short.
That's right. And as you said earlier on, look both ways before you cross the road. So you're not going to church on Sunday. We haven't convinced you thus far. And we've gone through the first 14. Surely they're going to get better. I mean, we've got 365 of them. Next week, we're going to kick off from Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, for those who want to do their homework, because there's a whole list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, apparently, Messianic prophecies fulfilled of the 365 Messianic prophecies that we're looking at. Oh, my goodness. Thank you, my friend, Rabbi Michael Skobac of Jews for Judaism in Canada. JewsForJudaism.ca. JewsForJudaism.ca is the website. You can also find him on Facebook and, of course, on YouTube. It's the Jews for Judaism YouTube channel. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And all of those links, by the way, I do believe, are on the website, JewsForJudaism.ca. Do go there and have a look, because there's an enormous amount of information that you can get for free on that website. It's an excellent website. My friend, once again, thank you for coming back onto Truth to You and going through this list with us. I'm looking forward to speaking with you very soon.
It sounds like a great proposition. We'll be there next week with you, God willing.
We're doing that. We're having fun. In the meantime, dear listeners, be blessed and be set apart by the truth of our Father's Word. Shalom.